every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. In the dead of a Central American night, the sky holds no comfort. It is a vast ink-black canvas, punctuated only by the indifferent glitter of distant stars. Below, the Nicaraguan jungle is a breathing entity, a tangled mass of greens and browns that swallows sound and light with equal efficiency. Through this oppressive darkness, a C-123 Provider cargo plane, a relic of a bygone war, slices the humid air. Its twin engines drone a monotonous, throbbing rhythm, a sound that feels both powerful and profoundly vulnerable. Inside, the cabin is stark and functional, filled not with passengers, but with cargo of a specific and illegal nature. 10,000 pounds of assault rifles, ammunition, and rocket-propelled grenades. This is not a flight sanctioned by any official government manifest. It is a ghost, a deniable asset in a secret war. The men on board are mercenaries, patriots, or criminals, depending on who you ask. They are cogs in a machine they only partially understand, a machine operating in the deep shadows of American foreign policy. On the morning of October 5, 1986, that machine would violently break down. As the plane descended towards its clandestine drop zone, a young Sandinista soldier on the ground, barely 18 years old, shouldered a Soviet-made surface-to-air missile launcher. He peered through the sight, acquired his target, and fired. A streak of smoke and fire tore through the sky, culminating in a devastating impact on the plane's right engine. The aircraft shuddered, its drone turning into a terminal scream. It cartwheeled through the air, shedding metal and fire, before plummeting into the jungle canopy below. 2 American pilots and a Nicaraguan radio operator were killed instantly. But one man, a former CIA operative named Eugene Hazenfuss, was thrown from the disintegrating fuselage. He managed to pull the cord on his parachute, his body a rag doll against the forces of gravity and geopolitics. As he drifted down toward the hostile jungle, he was not just a lone survivor. He was a walking, breathing piece of evidence. He was the first thread to be pulled, the one that would begin the unraveling of one of the most complex and constitutionally perilous scandals in modern American history. The story of the Iran-Contra affair is not one of a single crime, but of a sprawling conspiracy born from 2 separate, seemingly intractable foreign policy crises. It is the story of a presidency so committed to its ideals that it built a secret government within the government to achieve them, an apparatus that operated beyond the reach of law and congressional oversight. Today, we will not merely recount the events. We will dissect the very structure of this clandestine world. We will explore the anatomy of a shadow government. We will examine how good intentions, ideological fervor, and a belief in executive supremacy led a small group of men, convinced of their own righteousness, to sell arms to an enemy state, divert the profits to fund an illegal war, and lie to the American people and their elected representatives, all in the name of patriotism. To understand the origins of this shadow government, we must first travel back to the early 1980s, to a world defined by the stark, unyielding logic of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan had been elected on a promise to restore American strength and prestige, to stand tall against the perceived threat of global communism, a force he famously labeled the evil empire. This worldview was not just rhetoric, it was the fundamental organizing principle of his administration's foreign policy. And in 2 disparate corners of the globe, this principle was being put to the test. The first was in the Middle East, specifically in Lebanon, a nation fractured by civil war and a breeding ground for radicalism. There, Americans were being taken hostage by terrorist groups with deep ties to the Islamic Republic of Iran, a regime that had, just a few years earlier, held 52 American diplomats captive for 444 days. For Reagan, the sight of Americans in chains was an intolerable symbol of national weakness. Publicly, his administration adopted an ironclad policy. America does not negotiate with terrorists. It was a clear, strong, and unequivocal stance. Privately, however, the president was haunted by the plight of the hostages and their families, expressing a deep personal anguish over their fate. The second crisis point was much closer to home, in the small Central American nation of Nicaragua. In 1979, the long-reigning U.S.-backed Somoza dictatorship had been overthrown by the Sandinista National Liberation Front, a left-wing revolutionary group. The Reagan administration viewed the Sandinistas not as nationalist reformers, but as a dangerous beachhead for Soviet and Cuban influence in America's backyard. The domino theory, the idea that one nation falling to communism would trigger the fall of its neighbors, was alive and well in the White House. To counter this threat, the Central Intelligence Agency began to covertly fund, train, and arm a collection of anti-Sandinista guerrilla groups known collectively as the Contras. This was a classic Cold War proxy fight, a battle to be waged by others on foreign soil to contain the spread of a rival ideology. For a time, this covert war proceeded as planned. But then, Congress began to ask questions. Reports surfaced of CIA-directed mining of Nicaraguan harbors and of human rights abuses committed by the Contra forces. A war-weary public and a skeptical legislature grew increasingly uncomfortable with America's deepening secret involvement. In response, Congress acted. They passed a series of legislative measures known as the Boland Amendments. The most restrictive of these, passed in October 1984, was explicit. It prohibited the Department of Defense, the CIA, and any other agency or entity of the United States involved in intelligence activities from, directly or indirectly, supporting military or paramilitary operations in Nicaragua. For the administration, this was not just a policy disagreement, it was a legislative straitjacket. The president, the commander-in-chief, was being told by Congress that he could not conduct a foreign policy he deemed essential to national security. The two great problems, the hostages in Lebanon and the Contras in Nicaragua, were now joined by a third, a Congress that stood in the way. It was in the crucible of this frustration, this ideological conviction, that the shadow government began to form. The architecture of this clandestine operation was not designed in one fell swoop. It was assembled piece by piece in quiet meetings and whispered conversations by a small, tight-knit group of men inside the National Security Council, or NSC. The NSC, housed within the Executive Office of the President, was traditionally an advisory body. It was not meant to be an operational one. But under Reagan, it became the nexus of covert action, precisely because it was less subject to congressional oversight than the CIA or the State Department. At its head was National Security Advisor Robert "Bud" McFarlane, a disciplined, if often tormented, former Marine. His successor would be the stoic, pipe-smoking Admiral John Poindexter, a man who believed deeply in protecting the president. But the engine, the true operational heart of the affair, was a man who worked for them both, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, United States Marine Corps. North was a force of nature. Charismatic, energetic, and possessed of a ferocious work ethic, he was a decorated Vietnam veteran who saw the world in black and white, a relentless battle between freedom and tyranny. To his superiors, he was the Kando man, the aide who got things done, no matter the obstacle. He embraced the Nicaraguan cause with religious zeal, seeing the Contras as the moral equivalent of our founding fathers. When the Boland Amendment cut off official funds, North took it as a personal challenge. He became the de facto commander of the Contra resupply effort, a quarterback running a game that was, by law, not supposed to be played. Working from his office in the old Executive Office Building, just steps from the White House, he began to build a network. He solicited funds from wealthy American donors and from foreign governments like Saudi Arabia and Brunei, who were willing to contribute to the anti-communist cause. He coordinated with retired military officers and private arms dealers to create a logistical pipeline of weapons and supplies. This network, which came to be known as the Enterprise, was a private off-the-books foreign policy machine. Accountable only to North and his superiors at the NSC, it was, in effect, a shadow CIA. While North was building his Contra support system, a separate, equally secret initiative was taking shape to address the hostage crisis in Lebanon. The trail, as it so often did in the labyrinthine politics of the Middle East, led through Israel. Israeli officials, who had their own complex relationship with Iran, approached the Reagan administration with a tantalizing proposition. They claimed to have contacts with a faction of moderates within the Iranian government, men who were supposedly willing to use their influence to secure the release of the American hostages in Lebanon. There was, of course, a price. These moderates needed American-made weapons, specifically TOW anti-tank missiles, for their ongoing brutal war with Saddam Hussein's Iraq. The proposal was a direct violation of the Reagan administration's own stated policy of not negotiating with terrorists and of an international arms embargo against Iran, a state sponsor of terrorism. It was a political third rail, yet, for a president deeply pained by the hostage situation, the temptation was immense. In the summer of 1985, after much debate within his inner circle, President Reagan gave his approval for Israel to act as a middleman. Israel would sell a shipment of TOW missiles to Iran from its own stocks, and the United States would then replenish Israel's supply. The hope was that this gesture of goodwill would lead to the release of the hostages. In September 1985, a shipment of 508 TOW missiles was delivered to Iran, and in return, one American hostage, the Reverend Benjamin Weir, was released. To the architects of the plan, it seemed to work. A secret channel had been opened, and a life had been saved. They were now invested in the logic of the deal, a logic that would prove to be a siren song, luring them deeper into treacherous waters. The initial success, however limited, emboldened them. The operation was brought in-house, directly under the control of the National Security Council. The CIA was tasked with the logistics, and Oliver North, the man who could get anything done, was placed at the center of the operational planning. The two secret operations, the arms for hostages dealings with Iran and the private funding of the Contras, were now running on parallel tracks, both orchestrated from within the small, insulated world of the National Security Council. The Iran initiative was a constant source of frustration. The so-called Iranian moderates proved to be elusive, and the hostage-takers' demands only escalated. More arms were shipped, first Hawk anti-aircraft missiles, then thousands more TOWs. but the releases were sporadic and were often followed by the capture of new hostages. It was a grim, transactional bazaar, where American foreign policy was being bartered for human lives, with little to show for it. Meanwhile, the Contra resupply effort was a constant struggle for cash. Private donations and foreign contributions were helpful, but they were unreliable. The enterprise was always on the verge of bankruptcy, its ability to keep the Contras in the field a week-to-week proposition. It was in late 1985, amidst these dual frustrations, that a connection was forged between the two secret worlds. The idea, in its audacious simplicity, was quintessential Oliver North. The United States was selling weapons to Iran through a chain of intermediaries and arms dealers. Why not mark up the price? Why not overcharge the Iranians for the missiles, and then use the profits, the residuals, as they were euphemistically called, to fund the Contras? It was a neat idea, a perfect circle of covert action. The money from one illegal operation could be used to finance another illegal operation. It would solve the Contras' funding problems in one stroke, freeing the administration entirely from its dependence on a meddlesome Congress. It was the final, critical component in the construction of the shadow government. This new entity would not only be secret and unaccountable, it would be self-financing. The plan was presented to National Security Advisor John Poindexter, who had replaced Bud McFarlane. Poindexter, a man deeply committed to shielding the president from political fallout, approved it. Whether President Reagan himself was ever explicitly told about this diversion of funds would become the central, unanswerable question of the entire scandal. Poindexter would later testify that he made the decision himself and deliberately insulated the president to provide plausible deniability. But to others, the idea that such a monumental decision would be made without the president's knowledge stretched the bounds of credulity. Regardless, the decision was made. The enterprise, now flush with cash skimmed from the Iranian arms sales, escalated its operations. A complex financial network was established, run by North's private associates, retired Air Force Major General Richard Secord, and his Iranian-American business partner, Albert Hakim. Money was laundered through a web of Swiss bank accounts with code names like Lake Resources, moving from Iranian arms purchasers to the private coffers of the enterprise, and then out again to buy weapons, planes, and supplies for the Contras. For a few short months, from the spring to the fall of 1986, the shadow government operated at the peak of its power. From his office in the heart of the American executive branch, Oliver North commanded a global covert operation. He directed arms shipments to the Middle East, managed secret bank accounts in Europe, and oversaw a clandestine air force in Central America. He communicated with his network of operatives using encrypted devices, convinced he was fighting a noble battle on behalf of a president hamstrung by a naive and obstructive Congress. He was, for all intents and purposes, a Secretary of State, a CIA director, and a Secretary of Defense for a government that officially did not exist. The system was designed to be impervious to outside scrutiny, a closed loop of secrets and deniability. But such systems are inherently unstable. They are built on a foundation of lies, and lies have a way of coming undone. The more complex the conspiracy, the more people are involved. The more threads there are that, if pulled, can unravel the entire tapestry. And in the fall of 1986, two of those threads came loose almost simultaneously, half a world apart. The first was the thread dangling from Eugene Hazenfuss's parachute after he was captured by the Sandinista army on October 6, 1986, he did not remain silent. He was put on trial in Managua, and in an effort to save his own skin, he began to talk. He spoke of his employers, front companies run by Oliver North's network. He claimed the flights were supervised by the CIA. The Reagan administration immediately and flatly denied any connection. Officials dismissed Hasenfuss as a private citizen, a soldier of fortune involved in his own misguided adventures. But the story didn't entirely disappear. It raised questions and created a low-level hum of suspicion in Washington. For the first time, a tangible piece of North's secret Contra-supply network had been exposed to the light of day. The men at the NSC knew they had a problem, but they believed it was containable. They had weathered journalistic inquiries before. They were wrong. This was different. This was a body, a plane, a survivor. Less than a month later, on November 3rd, the second, far more damaging thread was pulled. A small pro-Syrian Lebanese magazine called Al-Shara published a startling story. It reported that the United States had been secretly selling weapons to its arch-nemesis, Iran. The article even detailed a secret visit to Tehran by former National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane, who had allegedly traveled on a forged Irish passport carrying a Bible signed by President Reagan and a symbolic key-shaped cake. The story was so outlandish, so contrary to America's stated policy, that it was initially met with skepticism. But the sourcing was solid. The information had been leaked by an Iranian faction opposed to the deal. Within days, the story was picked up by the international press, and the White House was engulfed in a firestorm. The arms for hostages deal, the administration's most explosive secret, was now public knowledge. The initial reaction from the White House was one of frantic denial. On November 6th, President Reagan himself addressed the issue, stating that the reports had no foundation. He declared that the United States policy of not dealing with terrorists was unchanged. But the story wouldn't die. The evidence was too specific, the details too vivid. The press corps was relentless. 7 days later, on November 13th, the president went on national television to address the nation directly. He acknowledged that his administration had, in fact, opened a secret diplomatic channel to Iran. He admitted to providing what he described as small amounts of defensive weapons and spare parts. But he framed the initiative not as an arms for hostages swap, but as a strategic opening to moderates in a critical region. He insisted, "We did not, repeat, did not, trade weapons or anything else for hostages, nor will we." It was a statement that was, at best, a careful parsing of words, and at worst, a deliberate deception. Few were convinced. The president's credibility, one of his greatest political assets, was hemorrhaging. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere inside the White House was one of controlled panic. The architects of the secret policies knew that the public story was only the tip of the iceberg. The real danger lay in the undiscovered country beneath the surface, the diversion of funds to the Contras. That was the part of the story that could transform a political embarrassment into a constitutional crisis, an impeachable offense. As the political pressure mounted, Attorney General Edwin Meese was tasked with conducting an internal inquiry, a fact-finding mission to get to the bottom of what had happened. It was meant to be a way for the administration to get ahead of the story, to control the narrative. Instead, it would be the catalyst for the final, catastrophic revelation. During Thanksgiving week of 1986, Meese and his team of Justice Department lawyers began interviewing the key players, including McFarlane, Poindexter, and Casey. They also began reviewing documents at the National Security Council. It was there, in Oliver North's office, that they found it. On a Saturday afternoon, a Justice Department official stumbled upon a memorandum, a draft written in North's handwriting. It was a smoking gun. The memo explicitly described the use of profits from the Iranian arms sales to support the Nicaraguan Contras. The link was no longer a matter of speculation. It was there in black and white. The two secret operations were one. When Meese confronted North with the document, the Kando Marine's composure began to crack. The game was up. Meese immediately took the finding to the president. While the Justice Department was making its discovery, Oliver North launched into a last, desperate act of damage control. He knew which documents were the most incriminating. He and his loyal secretary, Fawn Hall, began what she would later famously describe as a shredding party. For hours, they fed stacks of paper into the office shredder, destroying the evidence of the enterprise, of the diversion, of the entire off-the-books operation. Hall even smuggled classified documents out of the building hidden in her boots and clothing. It was a frantic effort to erase history, to protect the mission and the men who had served it. But it was too little, too late. The diversion memo had already been found. The secret could no longer be contained. On November 25, 1986, a grim-faced President Reagan appeared in the White House briefing room with his Attorney General. Meese laid out the basic facts for the stunned press corps. Investigators had discovered that proceeds from the sale of arms to Iran had been diverted to the forces fighting in Nicaragua. The President announced that National Security Advisor John Poindexter had resigned and that Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North had been relieved of his duties. Reagan claimed he had not been fully informed of the activities of his own staff and expressed his deep anger and disappointment. The scandal now had a name, Iran-Contra. The shadow government had been dragged, blinking and exposed, into the full glare of public scrutiny. The subsequent investigations would dominate the political landscape for years, threatening to cripple the Reagan presidency and raising profound questions about the limits of executive power and the meaning of public accountability. The exposure of the diversion of funds opened the floodgates. The crisis could no longer be managed by press conferences and internal reviews. The scale of the deception demanded a formal, independent inquiry. Congress, which had been lied to and circumvented, was determined to uncover the full truth. A joint committee of the House and Senate was formed to conduct public hearings. Simultaneously, a special prosecutor, a fiercely independent and tenacious judge named Lawrence Walsh, was appointed as independent counsel to investigate any and all potential criminal wrongdoing. For the next year, the nation would be captivated by a spectacle of political theater and legal drama unlike anything seen since Watergate. The central question on everyone's mind was a simple one. What did the president know, and when did he know it? The public face of the investigation became the televised congressional hearings in the summer of 1987. For weeks, Americans were glued to their television sets, watching as the key players in the scandal were sworn in and questioned under the hot Klieg lights. The hearings featured a cast of compelling characters. The patrician, remorseful Robert McFarlane, who had attempted suicide out of despair over his role in the affair. The brilliant and evasive CIA director William Casey, who suffered a sudden, fatal brain tumor just as the investigation began, taking many of his secrets to the grave, and the calm, intellectual Admiral Poindexter, who testified that he had deliberately shielded the president from the diversion decision to give him plausible deniability, a justification that many found to be a disturbing rationale for insubordination and deceit. But the undisputed star of the hearings was Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. When it was his turn to testify, he did not come as a penitent bureaucrat. He appeared in his full Marine Corps uniform, adorned with ribbons and medals, a projection of martial honor and unwavering patriotism. He was combative, confident, and utterly unapologetic. For 6 days, he held the committee and the nation in his thrall. He admitted to shredding documents, to altering official timelines, and to repeatedly lying to Congress. But he framed these actions not as crimes, but as necessary, even noble, acts undertaken to protect a vital national security operation and a president he revered. He painted a picture of a dangerous world, of feckless politicians, and of dedicated patriots like himself, who were willing to do the dirty work to keep America safe. "I was authorized to do everything that I did," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. North's performance was a political masterstroke. He transformed himself overnight from a rogue operative into a folk hero. A wave of Ali-mania swept the country. Supporters printed T-shirts, bumper stickers, and sent thousands of telegrams to Congress in his defense. He tapped into a deep vein of American populism, a suspicion of Washington bureaucracy, and a respect for decisive, military-style action. He effectively put Congress on trial, accusing them of weakness and of endangering the nation with their legalistic quibbles. He argued that the operations he ran were, in his words, a neat idea, a clever way to advance the president's policies in the face of an incooperative legislature. Many in the public agreed, but for the committee's lawyers and more sober observers, his testimony was a chilling portrait of an executive branch run amok, an apparatus of government that believed itself to be above the law it was sworn to uphold. The committee's chairman, Senator Daniel Inouye, offered a powerful rebuke at the end of North's testimony, reminding him that the rule of law must govern, and that a zeal for a cause does not justify its abandonment. While the congressional hearings provided the public drama, the painstaking work of the independent counsel, Lawrence Walsh, was grinding away in the background, building criminal cases. Walsh's investigation would last for more than 6 years and result in the indictment of 14 individuals on charges ranging from conspiracy and obstruction of justice to perjury. Oliver North was indicted on multiple felony counts. He was convicted on 3, including obstructing Congress. But his convictions were later overturned on a technicality. The appeals court ruled that his immunized testimony before Congress might have unfairly tainted his criminal trial. John Poindexter was also convicted of multiple felonies, including conspiracy and lying to Congress. But his conviction, too, was reversed on similar grounds. The legal framework designed to compel testimony in congressional investigations, the granting of immunity, had ironically become a shield that protected the key figures from ultimate criminal liability. The investigation reached the highest levels of the Reagan administration. Caspar Weinberger, the former Secretary of Defense, was indicted on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice for allegedly concealing his notes about the affair. His trial was set to begin in early 1993, and it was widely believed that his testimony and the evidence contained in his personal diaries could finally shed light on President Reagan's own knowledge and involvement. But the trial would never happen. On Christmas Eve of 1992, just weeks before leaving office, President George H.W. Bush, who had been Reagan's vice president throughout the affair, issued a series of sweeping presidential pardons. He pardoned Weinberger and 5 other officials who had been indicted or convicted in connection with the scandal. In his pardon proclamation, Bush argued that the men were patriots who had been caught up in a politically charged process that criminalized policy differences. For the independent counsel, Lawrence Walsh, the pardons were a final devastating blow. He accused Bush of a cover-up, arguing that the pardons had completed the deception by preventing the full truth from being revealed in a court of law. With that act of executive clemency, the Iran-Contra affair, as a legal matter, was essentially over. The final report of the independent counsel concluded that both President Reagan and Vice President Bush had been, at the very least, aware of the illegal arms sales to Iran. It found credible evidence that Reagan knew the shipments were arms for hostages deals, despite his public denials. And while Walsh could not prove definitively that Reagan knew about the diversion of funds to the Contras, his report painted a damning picture of a president whose detached management style allowed his subordinates to run a rogue foreign policy and a culture of secrecy and deception that permeated the highest levels of government. The ultimate judgment on President Reagan's role remains a subject of historical debate. Was he a knowing and complicit leader who orchestrated the conspiracy, or a disengaged figurehead who was manipulated and protected by his fiercely loyal staff? The truth likely lies somewhere in the murky space between those two poles. But what is not in dispute is that the affair left an indelible stain on his presidency, a legacy of scandal that stood in stark contrast to his image as the great communicator and the restorer of American integrity. The Iran-Contra affair revealed a fundamental conflict at the heart of the American system of government. It was a clash between the power of the executive branch to conduct foreign policy and the constitutional authority of Congress to control the nation's finances, the power of the purse. The Reagan administration, in its zeal to combat communism and free American hostages, chose to resolve this conflict not through political negotiation or public persuasion, but through secrecy and illegal circumvention. They created a government accountable to no one but themselves. This brings us back to the central theme of our inquiry, the anatomy of that shadow government. It was not a formal entity with a charter and a headquarters. It was a network, a state of mind, a shared conviction that the ends justified the means. Its skeleton was the National Security Council staff, which provided the institutional legitimacy and access to the levers of power. Its circulatory system was the secret flow of money through Swiss bank accounts, a financial pipeline that kept it alive and independent of congressional appropriation. Its muscle was the private network of former intelligence operatives, arms dealers, and soldiers of fortune, the Enterprise, who carried out the missions on the ground, flying the planes and delivering the weapons. And its brain was a small group of ideologically committed officials, North, Poindexter, Casey, who believed they were acting on the president's true wishes, carrying out a policy they were certain was in the best interests of the United States, regardless of what the law said. The danger of such a structure is its isolation. Operating outside the normal channels of government, it is deprived of the checks and balances, the dissenting opinions, and the legal reviews that are designed to prevent rash and illegal actions. It becomes an echo chamber, where conviction hardens into certainty and secrecy breeds contempt for oversight. The men of Iran-Contra were not, in their own minds, common criminals. They were patriots serving a higher cause. but in their pursuit of that cause, they disregarded the very constitutional processes they had sworn to defend. They arrogated to themselves the powers of war-making, diplomacy, and appropriation that belong to the elected branches of government. The scandal served as a stark and sobering lesson in the fragility of democratic accountability. It demonstrated how easily a small, determined group, operating under the cloak of national security, can subvert the rule of law. The questions raised by Iran-Contra are not relics of the 1980s. They are perennial. Where is the line between presidential authority and congressional oversight? What are the acceptable limits of covert action? And what happens when those sworn to uphold the law decide that their own judgment is a better guide? The Iran-Contra affair never reached the constitutional crisis of Watergate. There was no presidential resignation, no impeachment. The key players largely escaped legal consequence, protected by appellate court rulings and presidential pardons. For many Americans, the story faded into a complex and confusing chapter of political history, but its legacy endures in the continued tension between the White House and Capitol Hill over the conduct of foreign policy and in the public's lingering distrust of secret government operations. It stands as a cautionary tale, a case study in how the architecture of power can be quietly rewired from within, creating a parallel government that operates on its own terms. The wreckage of that cargo plane in the Nicaraguan jungle was more than just the end of a single illegal flight. It was the first glimpse into a hidden world, a world where the formal government of the United States had been subverted by an invisible one of its own making. It revealed that the greatest threats to a constitutional republic sometimes come not from foreign adversaries, but from the shadows within. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.